Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Jake Doberenz. Jake wears many hats such as minister and university resident director. Jake dabbles in a variety of art forms such as podcasting and writing. Jake has earned 2 degrees from Oklahoma Christian University, a Bachelor's in Bible and a Master of Theological Studies. In 2020, Jake founded Theophany Media, a Christian entertainment and education company that explores the intersection of Christ and creativity. Jake lives in Oklahoma City with his wife and cat. Welcome to the show, Jake.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Well, I've got to ask off the top, what is your wife's name and what's your cat's name?
Yes, very important. I'm ashamed that I did not add that to my bio. Don't tell my wife, nor my cat. My wife's name is Samantha, and my cat's name is Simon.
Awesome. Samantha and Simon, then?
Samantha and Simon.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, welcome to the show. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
I don't know. I have eclectic hobbies, and I like to create all sorts of different things. I don't like to be put in a box. I like to just do it all. So it's always hard to describe yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Bios are quite the challenge because I can't fit the 45 different titles I have in there. So that's all I'll say.
See, Jake, mine is easy because I just say like white suburban dad. That fills in a lot of boxes.
All right, fair enough.
So if you ever had me on your podcast, I'll introduce myself as white suburban dad.
There you go. I like it.
Well, thanks for being here. Kind of share your faith journey, what it looked like to you to come to faith, and what that looked like today.
Yeah, I'm that guy that was raised in church all his life. You know, the kind of cliche, when the church doors are open, you know, I was there kind of thing. Maybe not quite like that, but pretty close. My parents were both, lifelong members of the Church of Christ, and so I grew up in the Church of Christ, and that was just kind of the thing, and grew up among that, got very involved, church. What was actually what was a big turning point in my life, went back up a little bit, in elementary school, my dad worked at a Christian bookstore and then became the owner of the Christian bookstore, and one of the things that happened with that is we would travel, and he would sell books at conferences and lectureships and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the summer, he would take me along, and I went to a camp in Northern California with him, and I got to hear these kind of speakers talk about these things I never heard about, mainly apologetics and Christian evidences and that kind of stuff. So that was like summer after 3rd grade, and that kind of started to get me thinking. But fast forward to 6th grade, I just kind of was like amazed that like not everybody knew the things I knew. Like I was kind of confused. Wait, why isn't everybody a Christian?
Yeah.
It's kind of like obvious. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Not quite though, in reality. But that really started my journey, and I took my faith seriously, and even being in a public school, I was like the preacher kid, and people kind of knew what I stood for, and I was very vocal about that for several years after that. And then I come to college, and it's my first kind of Christian school environment, except for like preschool. And I get to have a Bible class for the first time, taught by somebody with a PhD. One of my first Bible classes, Old Testament professor. The guy knows 9 languages. Half of those are dead languages. Like really smart people. And I'm suddenly getting to learn from them. And they tell me some things that were different than I had learned growing up. And so that was definitely a challenge of trying to work through that. And sort of... I don't want to say hating them, but just being so frustrated with, why don't you believe what I believe?
Yeah.
But you're also a really smart person, so what's going on? So a little bit of a crisis. There wasn't really a moment, more like just a series of steps on certain issues that I was just like, okay, actually, I don't hold that as firmly as I once did.
Yeah.
And voila, I'm here today, a very different person than 6th grade Jake. Most definitely.
Oh, I'm so glad I'm a different person than 6th grade Lauren, but I mean... It's interesting, Jake. I'm kind of the inverse of you because, I'm pretty much my entire educational experience has been Christian schools, save for 2 semesters at a few semesters at a state school. But, I mean, I have a lot of education. 99% of it is Christian based, interestingly enough. So what has been a spiritual practice that's been meaningful for you or you might recommend to others?
I was always told to read your Bible, and I still like that. I think there's a lot of good stuff in the Bible and all that, and I would even tell people that as a kid. But the actual discipline was a lot harder. And I think what changed for me is I gave myself permission to read the Bible at my own pace, to take my time to really sit with it. So I'm not saying these are bad, but I reject the Bible in a year plan. I feel like it's just read through it really fast, just check it off the list just to say you checked it off the list. So a spiritual practice that's been really beneficial for me is just reading the Bible, taking it slow, asking questions, doing digging. If there's something really weird in there, stop and try to figure out what's going on here. Just take it slow. So I have read through the Bible. It took me almost 2 years, but it's not a race, and I just did that a little bit each morning and just took my time. And I really feel like I got something from it. And it wasn't just a box I had to check because, you're supposed to read your Bible or something. I don't know.
Yeah. It's funny. I just started again a reading the Bible in a year program. And one thing that's coming across to me is, man, the Bible is weird, but that's another conversation that we don't have time for today.
Yes.
Well, Jake, I brought Jake on because I got a chance to talk to him and, enjoyed chatting with him. And he's actually, I think, my first guest with a background in the Church of Christ. So, Jake, I think we talked about this, but we're kind of like estranged siblings because I'm ordained in the Disciples of Christ. And, I mean, Church of Christ, along with Independent Christian Church, comes out of this restoration. That's the right word, right? Restoration movement from a couple guys, Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, and we're already boring people with, unnecessary church history. So Jake has, as we were talking, Jake's done a lot of work and done a lot of stuff as I've read in his bio. But the thing that I wanted to hear from Jake's perspective, because I think this is a perspective that happens to a lot of people in many different contexts, pastors specifically, and church leaders, is when you find yourself in a church that doesn't necessarily fit in your own kind of theology. The first church I served as a solo pastor at was a church that I was, very much more to the left than the church congregation as a whole. So kind of describe your experience, Jake, and then, what's been the biggest struggle, I think, for you in that context?
Yeah, well, the Church of Christ is a really hard, don't tell him I said this, denomination to kind of,
only the restorationists would get that inside joke.
Yeah, well, you're right, yeah. So little quirk of the Church of Christ. We don't like to call ourselves a denomination.
Yeah.
We're just, the regular church. Everybody else is a perversion. Just kidding. So it's difficult to kind of stereotype all of that because one of the features is autonomous churches and everybody kind of does their own thing. But in general, there are some things with the Church of Christ where I could say they lean a little bit more conservative. Actually lean pretty conservative in most cases. If we're looking at everything in a spectrum, which I don't always like the liberal to conservative spectrum. I think my journey doesn't quite fit on a spectrum. There's some loop-de-loops and things like that.
Yeah.
But for the sake of ease, the Church of Christ is a lot more conservative, specifically among the older generation, as I'm sure it's the same case in a lot of different churches.
Yeah.
So, I'm ministering in this kind of context, having more of an education than most of my congregation, at least specifically more of a biblical education, having these views, having read different things. So I am ministering in a congregation that is a lot more conservative than where I am at.
Mm-hmm.
And I've kind of found myself sort of accidentally in this ministry role. I started as a college minister. Now I think I'm the associate minister, but I like to say I'm the minister of miscellany. Like, it's just whatever needs to be done. That's what I do.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to do it. And so I'm in this context, not the main guy in charge, so to speak, but trying to impact people and teach them and all of that. But then still finding myself having to navigate from what the church mostly believes and then what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this. One of our secretaries has been at the church for almost 30 years and has been working at the church for 30 years and has attended the church longer than that. And she's kind of like our de facto church historian. She has described my congregation as just left of center, which is interesting because what center in this case is probably like stereotypical Church of Christ.
Yeah.
So I guess we're left of that.
Yeah.
Because if you're divorced and remarried, we don't hate you. So that makes us more progressive than some other churches, I suppose.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. And we do have a good variety. And so that makes it nice that there is a variety of views in people.
Mm-hmm.
I have been at congregations and worked with congregations and seen other congregations that pretty much down the line you can tell who did they vote for in this last election and what do they believe. My church has some diversity, and so I do really appreciate that.
Yeah. What would you say? I'm. It's interesting what you said about the biblical education piece, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that. Even now, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. In that, I think I heard this somewhere that we get people for an hour a week, in many cases, and they get their cable news for 20 hours a week, something I don't remember, but it's just kind of like bonkers when we think about how much the average person gets in church on a Sunday morning, only in most cases, versus what they get everywhere else. To some extent, that's going to be inevitable. There's going to be this divide between the clergy, who are very educated and well-versed in biblical education, versus folks in the pews or in the chairs or whatever they're sitting on, who have little education, and it is what it is. Do you think that divide can even be overcome, or is it just something that we're just going to continue to navigate?
It's a really hard one, because what I don't want to say is everybody needs a Bible degree.
Yeah.
I also don't want to say just because I have a Bible degree that I'm better than anybody else, you know. And so that makes it really challenging. Even when I bring up my credentials, if I'm having a certain discussion, no, I actually studied this in graduate school. Mm-hmm. People accuse you, of being elitist or something, or whatnot, or they often repeated refrain that like the Gospels are at a 5th grade reading level, which is true to some extent, but that doesn't mean there aren't complexities there. And we're reading this in English, and it wasn't in English, so there's some stuff we have to dig on.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in the Church of Christ tradition, speaking to the people I know the best, we have historically really valued knowing your Bible super well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, have also historically been really weary of scholarship that's seen as secular and liberal and all that kind of stuff. So that's a really interesting kind of thing. We didn't get the first PhDs in Church of Christ until probably the 50s or 60s, and even then it was pretty rare. My alma mater, Oklahoma Christian University, it wasn't too long ago when their Bible department were all local ministers.
Interesting.
Not PhDs.
Interesting.
But that shift has happened.
Yeah, I don't know if Church of Christ would consider themselves as part of this, but I feel like kind of the fundamentalist movement within American Christianity kind of had this aversion to scholarship, while also this like real appreciation for the Bible, of knowing the Bible. Because I know I grew up Independent Baptist, and it's funny, there's a network of churches that were very averse to the idea of being a denomination, but were, for all intents and purposes, a denomination in that same way. Very, very biblically based, but kind of, at least historically, very averse to kind of scholarship in that same way. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I know I didn't really answer your question or solve it, but just some of the background of the issue. It really comes out of this like Enlightenment rationalism.
Yep.
We can just like think our way into salvation or something like that, and sometimes pulling in other resources or admitting that we don't have all the data already preloaded into our brain. That can make people really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I recognize that. I think there's a shift in a lot of churches valuing education and different viewpoints too, because that's really what education provides. Isn't just a bunch of smart people just telling you, a bunch of random things, lecturing at you. It's also about looking at different perspectives and being exposed to things that you're never exposed to before. And that's what leads you to think, wait a second, this thing that I believe, this other person has really good reasons to believe something different.
Yeah.
What do I do here?
Yeah. What would you say, like, what keeps you, kind of getting back to this idea of you or a listener serving in a church that doesn't necessarily fit with them where they're at theologically? Like, what keeps you, or what has kept you in a church that doesn't necessarily align with your theological viewpoints?
The answer is I love my tradition. I know the Church of Christ. I know our quirks, the language, the style of worship. I know this place, and so I feel a connection to what we do. I feel like I couldn't so easily jump ship. I would be abandoning this tradition that has shaped me and done a lot of good for me.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it. There are progressive churches of Christ out there. There's a couple in town that probably could line up with my views pretty exactly, that are still considered Church of Christ. But I just feel like this tradition, the traditional kind of expression of the Church of Christ, I just feel called to this place. I suppose like a mission field of sorts. These are my people.
Yeah.
And if I jump ship, they're never going to change.
Yeah.
They're never going to know. If all the good people leave.
Yeah.
Well, let me rephrase that, not good. But, if these people with these other viewpoints leave,
Yeah.
then it's just going to become this monolithic thing, and that's going to be super destructive.
Yeah. So you if I'm hearing you right, you really see it as an opportunity to bring change to the system then, yeah? Partially, at least.
I want to... Right. Recognizing some limits, recognizing that I can't force change.
Yeah.
Ministry, as you know, is kind of weird,
Yeah.
to say the least. And so in one sense you're the leader, but also there's a sense in which the church, I don't know what the phrase, almost said owns you, but that's not a good, the church is also sort of your bosses in a case.
Yeah.
And like you're serving them and leading them at the same time.
Right.
And it's really complicated.
Really complicated.
So what I can't do is walk in tomorrow and said, guess what, guys? Here's what we're going to do. This is what we believe now, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to change everything. I can't do that without causing an uproar. And, church ministry is not about making everybody happy.
Yeah.
If it would, it just wouldn't work that way because that's impossible. So it's a incredibly difficult balancing act.
Yeah.
But I do think there's change. I've seen change. I'm surprised sometimes when, I'll be talking to a 70-year-old woman and she'll say some things that in my, I didn't think 70-year-old women would believe.
Yeah.
And how she has changed her views on things. Like, it can happen. People
Yeah.
can change. And that's what I'm here for. And really, ignoring the progressive / conservative kind of things, ministry is about changing people.
Yeah.
The whole goal is to leave them better than when you first came in. Hard to do that, but that's kind of the mission.
Yeah, I mean, it's why I shouldn't admit this on air, but this is one of the reasons why I still like to listen to a lot of quote-unquote conservative voices, because I think there's a lot of pastoral wisdom to be gleaned, wherever someone is on the theological spectrum.
Amen.
I want to respond just to something else I heard in your answer, and I kind of said I was going to ask you about this, so this is where I'm asking you about this. But I remember when I was in high school, there was this book by an author, I think his name was Henry Blackaby, and I've heard this name mentioned again on some of these podcasts I've been listening to, kind of this theme around like responding to where God is, like being a part of where God is, you can see God in work, in action. And I don't know, I certainly think this is true of like when I was very much on the conservative spectrum, and I don't mean to disparage my liberal progressive colleagues, but I think this can also be true in liberal progressive context. There's this idea that like God is only on our side and that God is only working, in churches that are aligned with our theological beliefs. And I've really been challenged by that of late to think about and to recognize and maybe even consider like participating in being a part of churches that don't necessarily align with where I'm at 100% theologically, but it's pretty evident that God is working. And like, I guess it's a very complicated question there for you to respond to, because I kind of got a theological question about, would you agree? And then B, like, what's your kind of like response to that in general?
Yeah, I definitely agree that, God is not on one party's side or the other. My company's named Theophany Media, and that theophany language, I use that deliberately because I believe God can show up in all sorts of places.
Yeah.
Burning bush.
Yep.
Sure, God can show up all sorts of places, and throughout Scripture, God shows up in foreign nations and through some questionable people, and God's still working and doing good. And because in these more conservative spaces that I spent so much time in, I got to know some people that I think are genuinely good, and these true saints. I can't just throw them under the bus because they don't believe this about Scripture and things like that, and they don't believe XYZ.
Yeah.
I see their heart.
Yeah.
And we have some disagreements, but I think God's too big to be fit in our boxes and just to be on one camp or the other.
I mean, I think like I would say too, like I'm thinking about I can't remember, Robert Funk. He was the Jesus Seminar guy. Obviously would be classified as super, super liberal in most contexts. But I remember reading one of his books a few years ago, and I thought, man, what a guy, what a man of faith. And I think it's hard. I think it can be really hard. I think this is where the divide or the stereotypes can get really difficult, because, like you said, like, I grew up very conservative. I know a lot of people who are very conservative still, and I consider them, like, I can see their faith. They're passionate about their faith, and there's some things that I disagree with. There's some things that I think are troubling. I think that might be a strong word, or at least have troubling implications and might even be negative toward other people unintentionally. But I do believe deep down in their heart that they have a deep felt desire to follow Jesus. And, like, I think if we have the attitude towards whatever people are theologically, that if we could see within them a deep down desire to follow the way of God, like, that would be a huge step.
Yeah, amen.
Do you think, I think I've kind of asked this question, but I want to answer it again just because I feel like it's such an important question, at least in my mind. Like, how, like, is there ways that you've found that you can begin to bridge that kind of divide between layperson and clergy as far as just knowledge, education? Like, do you think it's like, might it be like more opportunities for kind of small groups, theological discussions, even like Sunday morning messages that are kind of open-ended? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the cop-out answer depends on your context and all that.
Yeah.
I kind of think that's true. I think the smaller group environment is a great place to do that, where you're sitting with them in the circle and you're not the clergy, you're just another person with a perspective, and encouraging other people's perspectives, even sometimes bad perspectives or just like crazy perspectives, like, where in the world did you pull that out? Sometimes encouraging that gently while challenging when appropriate.
Yeah.
Can be really good. I think that, my church responds sometimes to some more kind of heady discussions, and our Bible class right now is going through G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, which is kind of crazy for a congregation of lay people to be going through just kind of casually.
Yeah.
And so, we're okay with having some of those discussions, and having that happen at church. And so I think that's good. I always am cautious about portraying myself as the expert, while also recognizing that, I don't want to show off, but I do want people to know, like, okay, I've kind of studied a little bit more than you on certain subjects.
Yeah.
But again, like, inviting those other perspectives, because even with study, there are things I can just miss.
Yeah.
And as a Bible class teacher for years and years, in those discussion-based classes, sometimes I'm just blown away by the perspectives given and the connections made that I just never did.
Yeah.
And just like in any kind of classroom management kind of thing, to pull from that realm, when people do good, you want to praise them, and when people put forth their opinion, even though they might be a little scared to, I want to encourage that. I want to show other people who aren't at that place that that's good what they're doing.
Yeah.
I like that. I want that feedback. Give me the challenge. Give me your perspective here. I don't know everything. I need your input here.
I'm hearing something else, like a theme, sub-theme kind of pervading your conversation here. This idea of trust. And I think this idea that, like, you've engendered trust with the congregation. And I think this has to be a foundation of any process, like especially, a pastor who's, more on the liberal end, working in a more conservative congregation. Like, there's going to be I think, a level of mistrust or distrust. And I think that can only come through time and relationship and patience.
Yeah, that's another reason why I'm hesitant to leave.
Yeah.
Because I know this is a project for a long time.
Yeah.
In my studies, I heard a stat once that it takes about 7 years to really build up enough relational capital to make a serious change.
Yeah.
And I haven't been in my church 7 years. It's just been about, in ministry, about 2, and then I've attended there a little bit longer. But the preaching minister, he was a youth minister there for 7 years and then became the preaching minister, and he's done that for a couple of years. So, and he's on board with a lot of the things kind of where I am. And so he definitely has, like I said, that relational capital to now we can start moving and we can start discussing things because people, trust him, because they trust us. Trust is definitely important.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've always struggled with is not trust, but patience to wait those 7 years.
Yeah, definitely.
So
yeah,
folks like you who have that kind of skill set, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So let me ask this then, kind of as a follow-up. Like, you talked about not wanting to leave. How do you know when it's time to leave? Like, I imagine there's going to be some situations where, you're super conservative working in a super liberal church and you've tried to be patient and it's just not working, or the converse, you're super liberal working in a super conservative church and folks just aren't interested in having conversations. Like, how do you know, like, or maybe, maybe it's just like, I've done all I can do here. Like, how do you know when the time is to say, hey, I'm done. I've done my job.
Yeah. That 7-year stat is probably a pretty good one if you've been doing this for a while and have engendered their trust, and then you try to make a change, it doesn't go over well. Probably, if you have a huge flop like that, you probably just lost a lot of that anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for me personally, I think having kids would change things. My wife and I don't have kids yet. Probably in the future. We don't take our cat to church, so it doesn't count. And I think having kids is going to change all that, because I know I can function in this environment and sort of be a chameleon and not hide what I truly believe, but when somebody says an opinion that's against what I believe, I don't have to yell at them. I can just nod along or say, all right, that's interesting perspective.
Yeah.
And my wife's there too. So we know ourselves.
Yeah.
But then you start bringing kids into the mix, and at home they're being taught one thing, and at church it's totally different.
Yeah.
That's going to be a larger issue. And I'm especially thinking of things like if I have a daughter, because I believe in inclusive ministry, that women are totally able to be leaders in the church, and my church is not at that point.
Yeah.
We're making some strides in that direction, but right now we're not at that point. And so having a daughter and her being told, or at least shown, you can't really do that even if this is your gifting and your calling. That would be really challenging. So hit me up again when I have kids and I'll see where I'm at. But for right now, I'm staying in this context, doing the best I can, because I know myself and my wife, and we can manage this mostly. So
yeah, it's so complicated, and having kids, folks can probably hear my kid in the background right now. And I think folks, it's such a challenge for parents to wrestle with. Last question before we take a break. What do you think conservative churches could learn from liberal progressive churches and vice versa?
Yeah, in general, I think I think conservative churches are really good at kind of knowing what they believe, sticking with what they believe, really making that a part of church life, making those beliefs foundational. Then on the flip side, though, liberal churches are they have the advantage of taking some of those beliefs a little bit more looser, asking those questions, understanding not everything's black and white. So, strangely enough, the advantages of both, I think, also become the disadvantages. We need to draw some lines around some things.
Okay.
We need to have some convictions. I'm not saying that like liberal people like change their mind every day or something like that.
Just every other day.
Just every other day. We need to have some convictions.
Yeah.
That I think, at least historically speaking, conservatives are really good at having convictions, and then that colors everything.
Yeah.
And then many of my liberal friends are a lot better at asking some of those serious questions. Questioning the status quo, and you can definitely fall into fundamentalism on the progressive side of things, most definitely.
Yeah.
But in general, they have a little more gifting in just kind of looking at things in a different perspective, examining some of those core beliefs. So, kind of an interesting answer, because they both have something to learn from each other. Again, total generalizations, but I think maybe in this case, the two extremes are not going to be your best bet. You need to have some firm convictions while also having those loose enough that you can change your mind if different evidence is presented, I suppose. Maybe that's a cop-out, I don't know.
I think that's like I would say, like, I had some lines in my church. Like, I would tell people, like, the fair foul lines. Like, I'm a baseball fan, so I would think of that as like a baseball field. Like, the right field foul line was like, we are LGBTQ affirming. And, if you're going to say anything that's super anti-affirming, like, this is probably not the church for you if that's who you are. My other like left field foul line was like, we're not substitutionary atonement theology people. So if you want to like be blood and guts, like Jesus blood and guts, like all the time, probably not your jam. So it was like I had some lines kind of thing, and I don't think that's impossible. And I think it gets to like the broader thing of like boundaries in life. I'm a big fan of boundaries. Not that they should always be rigid and impermeable, but I think generally like boundaries are a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Jake Doberenz. And Jake, appreciate the conversation here. Tell me, if you're Pope for a day, well, here, I'll tell you this. You can take this as seriously or not as you want to. If you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What's that day look like?
Wow. Well, I think I would have to abolish myself, being a Protestant. Immediately, just, abolish the papacy immediately. And
I need to get,
there you go.
I need to get more Catholics on the show, because by far, abolishing the papacy is the most common answer.
Oh, no. Man, I was cliche. I can't believe it.
Especially amongst, again, here I'll tie in Jake with our his restorationist siblings. This is a very common answer amongst my Disciples of Christ colleagues who've been on the show.
Well, I thought I was being original. Sorry.
I love it. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Quite a few that I would want to have some questions for. The first one that actually popped in my mind is James Cone. I got to read him for the first time last summer, and really enjoyed that work. And he didn't die too long ago.
Yeah.
I want to say like 2018 or something.
Yeah.
But I have some questions for him especially after reading The Cross and Lynching Tree, but also his other works, and I think he can speak into our culture today. Definitely would love to see what he thinks about all these discussions and controversies regarding race and critical race theory and all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first one I thought of.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I have a suspicion that the coronavirus pandemic is going to be remembered a little bit. I don't know. I think though, I guess back to, race in America, that I think some of the things we've experienced the last couple of years will be in the history books. Maybe not in the South, but in everybody else's history books.
Well, I don't know. I was reading about how Texas pretty much dominates the textbook landscape.
Oh, interesting. So I think, with the Black Lives Matter things and coronavirus, all this kind of situations that we've been going through the last little bit, probably the Trump presidency too.
Yeah.
This is going to have stuff that's going to reverberate in the future. The good historians will not forget.
Yeah. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
I hope we can play nice with each other, and with outsiders. I just wish Christians would be Christ-like. Is that so hard to ask? Feels like it sometimes.
Yeah.
I think listening is one of the most important skills we can have as a human being.
Yep.
And especially as a Christian, listening, understanding, having sympathy for specifically for the other, the one that's totally different than you. That's going to go a long way.
Yeah.
And I hope in the future we can really embrace that and put down our weapons and stop fighting each other and work together to, make this world the kind of world that it should be.
Yeah. Well, where can people find out more about you and Theophany Media?
Yeah, Theophany Media is at theophanymedia.com, and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at theophanymedia.com or at Theophany Media. I am at jakedoberenz.com, Doberenz, Doberenz, and I hang out there and also on those aforementioned social medias at Jake Doberenz, and occasionally write some things and stuff. And I have a newsletter. You can go to jakedoberenz.com/email. And it's called Funny and Faithful. So once a week I send out a humorous newsletter with some kind of spiritual message to it.
Why don't you, it may not be appropriate or fit in the context for all listeners, but why don't you plug your book?
Yeah, my book is... Before it?
I might have it closer to me than you do.
There you go. My book is Who We Are. It's subtitled 7 Christian Identities to Shape Your Life. It's geared towards a little bit of a younger audience, 20-somethings, which is where I fit in. And I just want us to kind of start the conversation about thinking about what does a Christ-centered identity look like? And specifically, what are some kind of identities that we sort of pick up from the world that we need to throw away? So it kind of gets the conversation going. But ultimately, I hope the book is step 1, and step 2 is to be involved in a church community. That's where that identity really gets formed with other believers, not reading a book. That's just the beginning.
Well, I appreciate this conversation. I'm a big believer in conversations and listening and learning from one another. So thanks so much for being on and joining me, and wish you well. May God's peace be with you.
Thank you so much. Love being here.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.